Thank you. Thank you for having, do I have my microphone on? So I think it's working. I feel like it's scary, though, to tell a pastor, take your time and share. All right, you all have been in those unending sermons. Don't worry, we're not going to go that direction. You didn't mean it. They're just going to take it back now. Anyway, but it really is good to be here. Isn't this a great way to spend a Friday evening, to just kick off the weekend and worship, just being with each other? And as I mentioned, I'm from this church, and so College First Church of God, most of you know where it's at, but if you just walk a couple minutes that direction, you are going to run into the stone building right there. That's where I spend many, many hours, much of my time over there, except for Sunday mornings. We have our contemporary worship service right here in this space. So this really is home to me right here. And this happens to be the exact room where my husband and I were married years before I ever knew I would be a pastor here. So it's funny how God surprises us and what he calls us to do along the way. And so I am married. I live on a farm about 25 minutes away from here, kind of between Mount Corey and Bluffton, for those of you in this neck of the woods. And so my husband, Eric, he farms full time. We have 4 kiddos. 12, 10, 8, and 5. And so when I am not in the church doing the stuff, then I'm at home doing the stuff. So you understand probably what I mean by that. So the majority of my time is spent running kids here and there, to practices, to rehearsals, band, choir, all the things that are taking place, and being on the go in farm life. And so does anybody here live on a farm? Live on a farm? Well, okay, I see some hands. And so when you live on a farm, everybody is all in. So, our kids are helping to drive the tractors, and they're helping to move the animals. And during harvest, everybody is all in, whether I'm running food to the fields or bringing grain to whatever elevator, right? So everybody's all in. And so this means that all of our family, including my little Josie at 5 years old, we all have our farm boots that we have in our home. So when you come into our back door, which really is our main door, you come into the side there, and we've got our boots pile right there. Anybody else have the shoe pile? Do you remember that? Okay, the shoe pile, even maybe it was years ago. We've got the shoe pile, and the farm boots belong in the shoe pile and not through the rest of the house. Because if you wear the farm boots through the rest of the house, you know what happens then, because there's a whole lot of stuff on those farm boots that I don't want into the rest of the house. And as I was thinking about this idea of the farm boots that really I walked right next to just to leave to come here, I was thinking about how it really does relate to our theme and to our lives of what it means to be a daughter of the Most High King. Because in our family, we operate as a family on mission. We passionately love Jesus Christ, and we want to teach our children to do the same. So that means as we are going with our boots on the ground, we are representing Jesus Christ to the world around us. And we see how Jesus, he lived this out in his everyday moment, right? So as he was going with his disciples from point A to point B, he never just went from point A to point B. The whole journey was part of the mission, right? As he's walking with his disciples, he's teaching the entire time. He stops while he's on a journey and speaks to the woman at the well. The journey was the mission. He didn't have any timeouts just for his travels. And I think that's something we need to apply as we are following Jesus in the everyday moments. And so our family certainly does not do this perfectly. We are far from it. But that is the mentality that our family has taken on. It was a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, my husband and I, both in our own prayer time, found that we came to the same conclusion. And thankfully, God was nudging us in the same direction. We just didn't realize it. But we started recognizing that our kids were getting older. We didn't have babies anymore. We had school-age kids, and it changed things. And so suddenly we're school-age parents, and we're with a bunch of other school-age parents. And my husband said, I just feel like God's calling us to the next thing, but I don't know what it is. We're not moving. We're not going overseas to be missionaries, anything like that. He said, but I think it's the next thing. I said, I am having the same nudge by the Spirit. And so we have been living into the next thing, which is being school-aged parents. that is our mission field, we recognized. And if we know that's our mission field, then everything that we do as school-age parents is going to reflect that mission field. So for example, when I go grocery shopping once a week, because when you live on a farm, you go grocery shopping once a week. Anyway, I make sure I pick up the extra thing of potato chips or pretzels. If I have time, I try to have the homemade cookies, because you never know when the kid's going to show up at the counter after school. Those after-school conversations that happen in between practices, that's where God tends to be at work, right? And our kids know this. And so they know they can bring their friends or the extra one from down the road that walks down, however it ends up. The kids are invited into our home because our home is one that loves Jesus. And we have the mission that anyone who comes into our home, we want them to know that we love Jesus whether they do or not. And so it also means that we sacrifice in the other areas of our lives. Again, not perfectly, but we sacrifice in the other areas of life so that way we are a family on mission at all time. And I think back to the boots that are laying by the back door and how there's still some mud on them because the work got really messy that the kids were doing or playing in earlier. My kids just love spending time in the woods behind our house. You get all kinds of stuff stuck to the boots right there. And in our family, as we are on mission, it gets really messy. And when Jesus was here on earth, it tended to be really messy too. He didn't have everybody just loving him and jumping on board with what he was saying, right? And that sometimes is where we are at as we're loving Jesus too. And so I love the thought of boots on the ground because it's preparing us for the messiness that God is calling every single one of us into. So for example, every Sunday afternoon, most Sunday afternoons, we have a group of people that gather together for Bible study. Sundays are jam-packed of going to church, leading services, having people at our home on the afternoons, getting back to the church for youth group. So we just have this rush that's always happening. And so the people come into our homes for a Bible study. Some of them go to church, some of them don't. It's a hodgepodge of how people ended up at our house in the afternoon. But our kids know it's their job after church to pick up their rooms, pick up the toy areas, because we want our home to be open and inviting to the families that are coming. What drives my kids nuts then is that after they've spent time straightening up their closets, straightening up the toys in the toy room, whatever it might be, the kids come in and mess up their space. You ever had that? They straightened up the toys and then they left and it's messier than when they started, right? And they've had it where they have the favorite toy and we've told them you need to share the favorite toy, and then it got broke because people came into our home and played with it. And so we've had to have the constant conversation as a family, but do we love Jesus more than anything else? If we are a family on mission, we're all on mission together. So I'm sacrificing, 5-year-old, you're sacrificing, because we want everyone that comes into this home, we want them to know that Jesus is here, that we love him, and that Jesus loves them too. And I want my kids to know at a young age that following Jesus, to be a son or a daughter of the Most High King, it is not always easy. Because I can chuckle at my kids who get a little upset that their toys are left out. But then I think of some of my own ministry situations that I find myself in. So one that comes to mind for me is I've been meeting with a young lady. It's been several years that we've been meeting almost every single week. It was like a friend of a friend that she just crossed my path. Some would say coincidental, some would say the Holy Spirit's ordaining. But however she came to cross my path, we've been meeting on a regular basis. And this young lady battles numerous addictions. And she comes into our home, sometimes we meet on Zoom. And her language is a lot different than what we use in our home. And the things that she's addicted to are used during our conversations. And I prep for our study time together, and at the end she says, I didn't really like any of it, what we read this week, right? And I hang up from the Zoom call or from her sitting at our kitchen counter, whatever it is, And she says, she had a great time. Then I turn to my husband, I'm like, am I wasting my time right now? Because I feel like I'm hitting my head against a wall. You ever been there? And in following Jesus, some days we feel like we're hitting our head against the wall. Are we wasting our time? Because my boots are getting really dirty and I'd like to just shine them and keep them clean. We are not called to shiny boots when we follow Jesus Christ. And so when the messy days come, I have to remind myself that, you know what? I'm a hot mess too. And Jesus keeps showing up for me. On the days that he's got to just shake his head at me sometimes, like, girl, I have told you how many times now to get this together. And I'm still struggling, right? Whatever that might be, I'm thankful that I have the one that loves me, that says, Kimberly, I'm going to keep showing up. And so hopefully as we continue to spend time together, you'll be continuing to hear of, ladies, we need to have dirty boots. Because God's calling us into the messy areas of the world. And there are people in every single one of our lives who do not know the love of Jesus Christ. And so we need to have a joyful urgency to get busy. So once we have a bit more time and we're in our breakout sessions, I'm excited to talk with you a little bit more about the idea of what is your mission field, because you're probably in it right now. But are you recognizing it? And are you willing to take on the messy part of whatever your life might be? So, looking forward to spending more time with you soon.
Really excited to share a little bit about my story. I grew up as a young girl here while my dad went to college and then to Weinbrenner Seminary. And I think back to my younger years and all the people that just loved on me through the conference and who shared their love for Jesus and serving people. And I think of the foundation that built in my life for where I am today. And I think about many times, even in school, through my elementary years, hearing teachers or even other people in the community talk about, oh, that girl is always smiling and she's so friendly and she cares for people that don't have a lot of friends. And I can think back to times in school where there were kids who were kind of the outcasts and nobody wanted to be around them. And I would always befriend them, and I wanted to make people feel loved and included and things like that. And I think back to times where in my life I didn't always feel like I had somebody that wanted to be my friend, or, it kind of made me different that I would include other people that the popular kids in school wouldn't, right? And I think of the way that God wired me and put me together as a young child. And I think I got baptized about the age of 8, living out here in this area. And I remember having this thought that when I grow up, the thing I wanted to do was be a missionary. And as a child, I remember thinking that, okay, if I'm going to be a missionary, I'm going to go to India, or I'm going to go to Africa, or I'm going to go somewhere very distant. And so that was kind of like in the background of my mind as I was growing up as a young child. Through my junior high years, I started to go through some difficult times. I was sexually abused as a young lady, was very promiscuous, ended up addicted to drugs, married by 17, divorced. Just like some really rebellious things going on because of some of the traumas and hurt that had happened in my life. And I remember in my addiction, sitting in a closet on the floor saying, God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? Like, I need you to show up now and get me out of here, because at that time I already had 2 small children. And I remember days, and I'll be emotional because I'm an emotional person, but I remember days where I was not feeding my children. And my oldest son would go get something out of the refrigerator, even butter, and feed my daughter. And I look back at moments like that and I'm like, oh my gosh, it hurts to think about that. But I also think about my mom and how it must have felt like looking in at that. And I remember having children and youth show up at my door and later finding out that it's because my mom had called them. And I was so angry, right? But I look back at that and I go, thank God my mom loved me enough to recognize that I needed help. And to recognize that that didn't mean that it was over for me, right? God still had a plan for my life. And today I can look back at all the hurt and the pain and the junk that I went through in my past and see how God has really used that to give me passions in my life and to build connection and allow conversation with people who are really hurting and broken. And so I got into recovery, and I was attending Swadera Church of God in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the church was just filled with ladies who were so supportive of me. They encouraged me in different ministries I was feeling called to. One of those things, because my third and fourth child, their father, was in and out of prison all the time, and he was an alcoholic. And I had seen what they went through being separated from their father, and I'm like, hey, let's start this Angel Tree program through Prison Fellowship, and let's go and give these kids gifts, and you would go to their house and share the gospel with them, give them Christmas presents. And I'm like, but that's not enough. We need to be doing more. These parents in prison need to know who Jesus is. And so I'm like, let's start sending Bibles to the prisons. And within years, even after I had left Swadera, they're sending more than 200 Bibles a year to prison inmates around the country. So God just took these small things that he put on my heart and just multiplied all of these things, not because of an idea I had or because I had a few people that were encouraging me, but because I believe that he was using them and that congregation to stir up in me confidence that when God was going to call me to do something and I stepped out in faith, that he was going to supply and do whatever he needed to do to make sure that his work was moving forward, that his kingdom was going to be impacted by those things. And so one of the things I'll say in that is, if your gift is an encourager, be sure that you're really encouraging people that God is allowing you to see him doing something in. Because that could be a huge catalyst for a big move of God that's going to happen. And so the last thing that God had laid on my heart while I was there was to start a Celebrate Recovery program. And so we started this program in the church. We had a couple of guys who were attending who were in transitional housing. And they were talking about this woman who used to serve meals under a bridge in Harrisburg, the Mulberry Street Bridge. And they were talking about how she wouldn't be able to serve there anymore, and there was this need that was going to go unmet. And so we thought, well, we can go do this for a couple weeks, and then maybe somebody else will start doing this. And so we took crock pots of soup and some sandwiches and fruit, and we went down under the Mulberry Street Bridge, and we served the 7 people that were living there. And we went for a few weeks, and it was kind of okay, we've done what we were going to do. And so we stopped going for a couple of weeks. And I remember going back because my husband and I felt you know what, I think there's something more. God won't leave it alone. We have to go back. And so we get down under the bridge, and this man, his name was Jack. He was an AIDS patient. He had had AIDS for about 14 years already. And he was just this really interesting character. And he was very blunt, and he would tell you exactly what he's thinking. So we haven't been there in a few weeks, and he says to me, you know what I thought? He said, I thought you were one of those Christians that came down here to feel good about yourself and never come back. That statement changed the last 16 years of my life. because I walked away from that bridge thinking, oh my gosh, that breaks my heart. Is that what people really think about followers of Jesus? That we do things to look good or feel good, and we don't really care about them? Because that's not what Jesus did in his ministry, right? Jesus truly loved people. He met them where they were. Did he just say everything was okay with their life? No. But he loved them enough despite their faults. And I had to think about how he had loved me through those really difficult times in my life. And even when I chose to do the wrong thing, despite knowing what the right thing was. And so when we got home that evening, we had a really long conversation about this. And I'm like, you know what? I don't think that we were supposed to just go for a couple weeks and stop doing this. And so our group continued for a while to do this together. And then my husband and I realized, okay, this probably was not a ministry that Swadera Church of God was called to do, because other people are not affirming that that's what the church is called to do there. But we know that this is what God has called both of us to do. And so at the time, we had 5 children still living in our home. My husband was on unemployment. I was on disability, still struggling with mental health things from my addiction. And we're like, we don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to do it. And so every week, we would leave group, and we would still go down under the bridge and serve these 7 people that lived there. My youngest son was an infant, and there was this woman who was full-blooded Indian living under the bridge. And one day we're down there, and she says, I want to hold your son. And he's in the van sleeping in his car seat. And I'm like, feeling a little strange about this, because I don't really know her well. And I'm like, I don't know. And she's like, I lost my kids, and I haven't seen them in years, and I can't have a relationship with them, and like telling me this sad story about how she doesn't have any connection with her kids. And I take my son out of his car seat, and I hand him to her. And we had a very good friendship. In fact, I watched her take her last breath when she passed away. And I did her funeral for her. But through that time that we spent getting to know people and loving on them, we saw a lot of lives being changed and transformed by the Lord, because we were able to actually meet these people where they were and love on them. And I can tell you, if I hadn't been through some of the struggles in my own life that I had been through, I don't know if I could have done some of those things, or if I could have loved some of the people the way that they needed to be loved. And it's just been an amazing experience. And so over the years, well, actually within months of starting to do that, word travels really fast in the homeless community. And so we went from serving like 7 people to 120 a night within maybe a year's time. And remember I said we didn't have jobs, like we didn't have a lot of income, and we had 5 children we were feeding, and my husband was trying to do these side handyman jobs, and people in the community were starting to hear about what we were doing, and we'd have stuff dropped off on our porch and all this stuff starting to be provided. And I had met this lady who I was teaching. I was discipling her to start a Celebrate Recovery group in northern Dauphin County. And this woman wrote a letter to Joyce Meyer's ministry. I don't know if any of you heard of Joyce Meyer's before. And so she calls me one day, and I didn't know about this letter, and she says, hey, you know what? I won tickets. And I would like you to go with me to St. Louis to meet Joyce Myers because she's given us free hotel room. She's paid for our tickets to be at our conference. She's going to give us per diem every day to pay for everything that we need. They're going to fly us out there. They're going to get us back. And I'm like, absolutely. I could really use a break from 5 kids and my husband for a weekend. And I would love to hear Joyce Myers speak in person, right? And so I get out to St. Louis, and it's the second day of her conference, and this lady comes to my seat. Do you know Ginger from her show, the redhead? And she comes to my seat, and she's like, I really hate to bother you, but we picked your seat to play this game. Now, I already told you I don't like to be in front of people. And this is a conference with not 120, but 16,000 women in a football stadium. And I'm like, oh no, I am not going up there. Kim can play because she loves to be in front of people, but I am not going up there. And they're like, oh no, you have to. And I'm like, no, I'm not going up there. And she's like, well, I didn't want to tell you this, but we kind of lied to get you here. And we apologize. We are so sorry because we know that's a sin and we're not supposed to lie to you. And I'm like, oh gosh, what the heck is going on? And so then she starts telling me how I have to get on the stage, and this is really out of my comfort zone, not just speaking, but she wants to play a minute to win it game. And I'm like, there's absolutely no way because I'm going to look like a fool. And so I'm supposed to unravel these really huge things of decoration paper. And so I'm up there playing this stupid game and making a fool out of myself. And actually, I was going to go farther in my story, but I think I'm going to kind of wrap up with a little bit of this because I think it says more than I can say. So at the end of this game, she tells me, you know what? Kim told us about your story. We know that your situation and your family, and we just want to bless you and make sure that we help to move forward the kingdom and what God's doing through you and your family. And she said, Kim had shared this letter to the editor from your local newspaper with us, and she started reading it to this 16,000 ladies. And it says this, it says, a letter to the editor that we received at the end of March stood out immediately. It was mailed in snail mail, and the return address said only Joe Somebody. It looked like a joke or an unsigned complaint, which we occasionally receive, and we gave it a quick read. For all intents and purpose, my name is Joe, and I wanted to relay a story to you. I'm a homeless man living in Harrisburg area. Most people would consider me a pariah without hope or a future. Most would, except for a couple and their kids, which is the focus of this letter. There was something different here. The letter went on to describe how every Wednesday night a family from Halifax would come to Harrisburg to help the homeless. Patriot News writer T.W. Berger checked it out. His front page story on Monday revealed that the Ocasio family was not only real, but even more generous than Joe Somebody knew. The family doesn't have a 501c3 charitable foundation or an official logo. It uses its own van to distribute items. The mother's on disability, the father's a handyman. They have 5 children at home, all of whom join the Wednesday night caring trips. If Joe Somebody hadn't tipped us off, their efforts would likely have continued to go under the radar, just as they intended. Stories in Harrisburg area touch us all the time. Neighbors helping neighbors, a strong tradition of philanthropy, school students raising funds for Haiti or a classmate with cancer. Somehow this one stands out. The work of the Ocasio family reminds us all how little it takes to lend a hand to someone in need. The physical gifts that they bring, blankets, food, are useful. But what motivated Joe Somebody to write to us was the compassion of the family. Its dedication to come week after week, year after year. Having been on the streets of Harrisburg for years, there are no programs in the area that make me feel human, like I matter. They hang out with us and they talk to us. Their children hand out food and blankets and clothes. Ask yourself, how many people would allow their children to hang out with us or talk to us? The Ocasios are barely getting by themselves, Yet they take time to do things such as give to the homeless, rides to medical help, or to court. As the letter writer said so eloquently at the close of the letter, even with the economy as it is and as poor as they are, they come. Each time they come, they make me feel like a somebody. And I believe that that's what Jesus did, right? He always allowed people to know their value and the worth that they had. And if we look at Scripture, we can see that we were created with a purpose. And the purpose is not for us just to learn who Jesus is for ourselves, but the purpose is so that we can know Jesus and share him with other people to expand the kingdom of God. He put us here to have our boots on the ground, to do the work of him in this kingdom and in this world. And when we can look at people through the eyes of Jesus and see that they have worth and value, no matter what their situation is, no matter what their circumstance is, and we can start to look into our own lives and see maybe some of the passions that God has given us, some of the things that even set us off and offend us, and how God wants to use those things for his glory and for his purposes and his kingdom, I think then we start to see movement. And it's not always easy, like was shared a little while ago. It's not easy. I'm going through this thing that I haven't shared publicly except for at my church. So you're the first ones to hear it. But God has been giving me a really hard time over the last couple months. Because like I told you, this is something I'm passionate about. I love the people that we've been serving the last 16 years. This ministry to the homeless is like my child, right? But since maybe August or September, I feel God telling me, I don't want you to do that anymore. And I'm like, what? But that's part of who I am now. I've been doing that for 16 years. And it's also at a time where 3 of the kids that were at home when we started this are out on their own. I've got one in college, and I have one that's a junior in high school. And so all this transition is going on in my life, and I'm like, but God, are you sure? Like, it's more comfortable to continue to serve and minister in your kingdom the way that I have been. And he's going, no, April, do you remember how you went to Joyce Myers and I provided everything you needed for the ministry? Do you remember how a couple years after that, your home looked like hoarders lived in it, and I allowed you to buy a church building for $5? Do you remember how a couple years after that, the van was not running well that Joyce Myers gave you? And so I placed somebody else there to give you $40,000 for a new van. Do you remember how I've been faithful and I've provided and I've given everything that you need when you're faithful? I'm going, okay. And so you catch me in this time where I'm like, when I first said yes to coming here, I'm like, yeah, this is great. I'm going to share about the homeless ministry. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to share with you about how God is transitioning my life and how I believe that each one of us can look at our lives and can look at all the things that we can do, because some of us can teach, some of us can cook, some of us can all these things. But really there's one thing in our lives, whatever season of our life we're in, that God just wants us to focus in and where he wants us to meet people. And so that's what I'm hoping to share with you in my sessions this weekend is, okay, there are all these things that we can do, but where can you have the most impact? The way that God has created and wired you, the things that you've been through in your past, what is it that he wants to do with you right now? Because it might not be what you've been doing for the last 16 years that you're comfortable in. So thank you for letting me share. And I hope you all have a great weekend, and that as we leave here, that you will be putting boots to the ground where you go.
Okay. Hi. There we are. That's a whole lot better. Okay. Yes. I am Heidi Geyer. And I kind of feel like I'm going to be the Debbie Downer of the night. Have you? I don't know if some of you sinners have watched Saturday Night Live, and they have the Debbie Downer girl on early 2000s where, well, a Debbie Downer anyway is somebody who you like are really excited about something, and she comes in, or I don't know, I can't think of the male version of it, but they just turn everything upside down, like, oh, look at this beautiful wedding, and then the Debbie Downer comes in and says, yeah, too bad half marriages like end in divorce. So, but anyway, I don't want to rain. There she is. I don't want to rain on your parade, but my advancing the kingdom story involves sadness and loss and grief. And like April just said, I'm about to share something with you that I haven't really shared outside of too many circles. So that's part of the reason why I was kind of fighting with God about saying yes to this, because he said, I want you to talk about this, and I wanted to be like, no, this is my private story. But anyway, before I go on any further, I want to ask you all a question. How many in this room has never dealt with any form of grief? You've never lost a loved one. You've never missed out on something that you really wanted, something that was important to you. Okay, good. Then we're all in the same company, and we can go on and we can continue. I thought that would be the same. But as I said, I am Heidi Geyer, and as Kathy said, I am mom to 2 kids here on earth and 4 kids in heaven. I'm desperately waiting to meet. And these kids in heaven, like I said, aren't something that I talk a lot about. Hi, I'm Heidi Geyer, and I have 4 kids that I never got to meet or hold. It's not something you really want to talk about. I don't shy away from talking about this, but like I said, it's not something that comes up in conversation a lot, and like I said, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. But my journey really started with these losses. I said I am married. My husband and I have been together since 2000. Well, we started dating in 2002. We got married in 2005. And our relationship was long distance. We started dating right before I moved out here to Findlay to go to seminary for 2 years. And so he was back in southern Pennsylvania, and I was here, and that was a real test of our relationship. But then I graduated and moved back to Pennsylvania, and we started ministry together, and we were loving life and thought, we're going to start our family. And I myself came a little earlier than my parents were ready for, and so I thought, okay, God's just going to make that happen for us too, and it didn't. And so we went through testing, and nothing was wrong, and that was frustrating, and finally we got pregnant, and we were excited. Okay, God is going to build our family, and we're going to give this family to him, and we had our first loss. And I actually ended up having 3 losses in 10 months' time, which was very frustrating and very, there were 3 children that I desperately wanted and desperately longed for. And it was something that God had laid upon my heart. And I thought, okay, 1 loss, it's okay. These things happen, we move on. 2 losses, all right. Things are a little better, but then the 3rd loss is what really hurt the most, I think, because I became angry. And I don't like admitting this either. I was very angry with God. Because why would he allow me to conceive not once, not twice, not 3, but 3 times, just to take it away? Something that you longed for and desired, and it felt cruel, and I felt completely alone. Now, I would go on to have my first rainbow baby, Levi, who is now 12. A rainbow baby, if you've never heard that term before, it's a term of a baby who is born after loss of some sort, whether it's stillbirth or miscarriage or infant death, whatever. He has been my miracle among miracles and my rainbow after the storm. And his pregnancy was a whole roller coaster in and of itself, but that's a whole different story for a different time. But then we had him when we were getting ready to celebrate his first birthday, and I found out I was pregnant again. And then because of all the losses I had had in the past, I was able to get into the doctors early, and they were able to check me out and make sure everything was okay. And I had a very early ultrasound, and they determined that that one as well was going to be a miscarriage. And I remember having a strong face on, thinking, it's okay, these things happen, we'll get through it. And the nurse that was there with me, and I'm sorry, I'm going to cry through this, she put her hand on my shoulder, and she made me look at her in the eye, and she said, it's not okay. You are allowed to grieve this loss. And for the first time, I felt like I was given permission to grieve. Our society does not know how to grieve very well. We live in a world we live in a society that is very independent, and we want to stand up for ourselves, and we want to look strong, and we don't want to show weakness. A little more on that in a little bit. And I would go on to have our second rainbow baby, our daughter Kyrie, who is now 10, which I can't believe. And I love those rainbow babies. I love my children. I love both of them. And I know that if I wouldn't have had those losses, I wouldn't have those 2 kids with me here. But in a perfect world, on this side of heaven, all 8 of us would be together. And so I do look forward to that day when all 8 of us will be together in heaven and we get to celebrate together. But those losses were my real introduction to grief. I mean, I had lost loved ones in the past. I had lost great-grandmothers. I had lost great-aunts and uncles, and I loved them and missed them. And even by then, in that point, I had lost my paternal grandmother, who I loved and adored. But these 4 losses absolutely rocked my world and tore my heart open. Because they were children that were longed for. They were the hope of a future that was quickly taken away from me. And it introduced me to a journey and a club that I never wanted to be part of, which was a lost mom. And as I said before, our society doesn't give permission to grieve very well. We don't know how to deal with grief. We're too independent. If you look at other societies, they seem to have long, drawn-out ways to grieve the loss of a loved one, and groups come together and support one another. But in our society, I feel like if you're not over any loss, any death in about 3 months or so, what's wrong with you? You need to move on. Suck it up. And so there's a different category, too, for parents of loss, I believe, for one. It's an out-of-order death, whether it's a miscarriage, a stillbirth, an infant loss, SIDS, whatever, a teenage death, a child death, an adult death. It adds an extra level of pain. And that adult death, I remember seeing specifically when my grandfather a couple years ago had to bury his only son, my uncle. It just rocks your world entirely. But going through loss in general has helped me to see life in different ways, because each loss that I had was treated differently. And I learned who was safe to talk to and who I needed to just keep going with. In fact, at least one of the pregnancies, it was only our parents that knew we were expecting. We were afraid to tell anybody else. And I swore them to secrecy because I didn't want them to tell anybody else and then get the pity, oh, she had another loss. That's so sad. What's going on with them? But there was a handful of close friends, and particularly a cousin, that walked me through that journey because she herself had been through loss. She picked me up and she carried me and she dusted me off, and she gave me some ideas of how to grieve. She never told me how to feel, but she came alongside me and she gave me permission to feel what I was feeling. Hurt, sadness, anger, disappointment. And I had other friends that did the same, even one in particular that had never had a loss before, but she just knew exactly what I needed. Like God just spoke to her and said, she needs this, do this for her. And then she herself would go on to have a loss someday, and so I was able to walk her through that as well. In fact, when I was going through my losses, I remember my mom saying, maybe God is having you go through this so you can help somebody else. And at the time, I remember I wanted to punch her. But looking back, she was so right, because what I had gone through has really helped me learn how to deal with other people. And I also began to seek things out online, do some Facebook stalking from behind the scenes, and I stumbled upon a local place in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, called Sweet Grace Ministries. And they work with couples and families who are going through the loss. It was started by a couple who had their very first child had a life-limiting diagnosis, and she would end up being born still in 2003. And from a distance, this organization reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were other people who were going through things just like me. And so I would read their Facebook and their Instagram posts and secretly thanking God for this organization, because I wasn't ready to reach out and talk to them or get anything from them or even join a support group or anything. But slowly, God began bringing individuals to me, like my mom had said, that were going through some sort of loss, who were going through something similar. And I was able to walk alongside them. Now, several years ago, I had felt that God was calling me back to do a little more schooling and just to talk into some more pastoral counseling, just so I could talk to more people better. I felt like I would be more comfortable talking to them in ministry. And one of the things that I had to do was do an internship, specifically something that dealt with crisis and trauma. And so I felt God saying, reach out to Sweet Grace, talk to them, see if they could work. And thankfully, we were able to develop a partnership. And so I did a 6-month internship with them, and I was able to talk with families. And really, it was on the end of COVID, so we weren't able to meet with the support groups regularly, but I was able to meet on Zoom meetings, and I was able to make phone calls to recent lost moms and just support them and encourage them. And the one beautiful thing about Sweet Grace is they provide baskets for those who just had a recent loss, and miscarriage comfort bags for those who weren't just too far along yet, but just need a little something to help them along the way. And so it was such a beautiful thing. They reach out to, they've partnered with 20-plus hospitals in eastern Pennsylvania and northern Maryland, and they're expanding just all the time. And last year, they specifically sent out, I believe, 1,700 baskets to lost families, just last year alone. Now, my time at Sweet Grace helped lay a foundation to prepare me to begin a grief share group at church. Now, I wasn't too familiar with grief share. My parents go to the Shippensburg First Church of God, and they had started a program several years ago. And I remember my mom, who was the secretary at the time, would talk about, we started this program, and it seems to be really helping people. And so I was encouraged by what I was hearing. And then a few years later, my maternal grandmother had passed away. And so my mom and my grandfather and my father decided to all join this grief share group just to work through their grief and their losses of their parents. And I could see specifically with my mom how it was helping her. And so God had planted that seed in me. And so after I graduated school and finished my internship at Sweet Grace Ministries, I felt God calling me to start something new. And that was to start a grief share group at our own church. Because there's so many people out there who are hurting. And I believe that if I wouldn't have gone through the things that I had gone through, I wouldn't have had the strength to start what God had called me to do through Grief Share. Because, like I said, our society does not do very well with grieving. We want to go about our business. We're very good at encouraging people within those first few days when somebody passes away. We provide meals, we go to the funeral, but then the dust settles and most people go back to their regular lives. But when a family member dies, life doesn't go back to normal. Whether it's the death of a loved one or a loss, it's a new normal that people have to develop, and they just don't know where that starts. But Scripture is very clear that death is a natural part of life. For example, David says in Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit." And Jesus himself said, "Blessed are those who mourn." I believe Jesus was the great comforter, and I believe he's calling us to be better comforters to those around us. One of my favorite passages about how to deal with somebody who is grieving is from Job 2. If you recall that Job was a wealthy man, he had all different kinds of possessions, he had many kids, he had lots of cattle and lots of land. And Satan kind of picked on him because he just absolutely loved God. And Satan came to God one day and said, "I think he only loves you and he only worships you because you have given him all of these things." And so God agrees to have it all taken away. And within minutes, Job loses everything. His cattle, his home, his children, but just a few workers and his wife. Everything is gone, and Job is in great distress. And three of his friends heard about what had happened. They dropped everything, and they go to be with him. And Job 2:11-13 says, "Now when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. And when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great." They came and they just sat with him. We call this the ministry of presence, that the best thing anyone can do when a family member, friend, coworker is hurting is just to sit and be with them. Call them, text them, and only say, "I'm so sorry." Because sometimes those that are hurting, even if they're believers, don't always want to hear Bible verses or God has a plan. Because as believers, specifically, we know that, but we don't always want to hear it at the time. We just want somebody to comfort us without preaching. And if you read further in Job, you see that his friends do that. In fact, they say lots of things that really aren't true about the loss. But when you're going through grief, especially when it's fresh and raw, all you want is someone who will show you support. I remember when I went through my losses that there were some people who would come up to me and they would say nice things, but at the time, it hurt. They didn't necessarily mean to hurt me, but it still hurt, just because feelings are raw and emotions are raw. And so the best thing to do is to walk along someone who is grieving. We all know someone in our lives that has some sort of loss, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the loss of something that was really important to them, the loss of a friend, of a job, the loss of a pet. Whatever it is, I think we need to do a better job of coming alongside people. And so that's what I've been able to do with Sweet Grace Ministries and Grief Share, giving support during dark times of people's lives, showing love and compassion when people really are at their worst. Some beautiful relationships have really come out of walking alongside somebody in grief. Because people are at their lowest, And a quiet presence can really go a long way. And there's some sort of camaraderie among people when you're around people who really understand, who get it. And we've seen, especially through Grief Share, so much discipleship that happens, that goes on. Just one final story about the Grief Share. We've run 3 cycles, and 2 of the cycles we've had a couple that has come, and the woman, her grandson passed away. And so she went through it, through Grief Share, and she got so much out of it that she wanted to go through it again. And after going through it a second time, she felt God calling on her heart to start a Grief Share at her church, because she wasn't part of our church. And we've had people from outside come in, or non-believers that have come in, even for just like the Christmas one that we do. And people are growing and hurting, and I think people are very open to faith and God when they've lost things. Not initially, but as we come alongside them and show them love and show support, they're very open. Because grief and loss are inevitable in this world. And I think we need to do a better job of normalizing it, making it something that we're not uncomfortable to talk about. So that's basically what my breakout session is going to be about tomorrow. How can we get better at loving people and coming alongside them and being part of that ministry of